With the Strait of Hormuz effectively stalled and 20 million barrels of daily supply hanging in the balance, a new war in Iran has sent American pump prices climbing 26 cents in a single week. This isn't just a market fluctuation, it is the sudden, violent reopening of a century-old geopolitical wound. Before it was a global commodity, oil was a colonial secret. British geologist George Bernard Reynolds struck a gusher in Masjed Solomon, transforming Persia into the liquid empire of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. By 1913, a young Winston Churchill recognized that the Royal Navy's future lay in the energy density of oil over coal, leading the British government to acquire a controlling interest in what we now know as BP. This control was not ceded quietly. The 1928 Red Line Agreement effectively carved up the former Ottoman Empire into a corporate monopoly, binding Western partners to a self-denial clause that forbade independent exploration. While the Seven Sisters cartel dominated 85% of known reserves, the actual inhabitants of these lands saw only 16% of the profit, fueling a resentment that would eventually boil over into the 1951 Abadan crisis. When Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh moved to nationalize his nation's oil, the West responded with Operation Ajax in 1953 that replaced a democratically elected leader with a pro-Western monarch. This intervention secured the flow of crude for the post-war industrial boom, but it established the resource curse, a paradox where mineral abundance leads to political instability rather than prosperity. The 1973 Yom Kippur War finally shattered the illusion of cheap, endless energy when OPEC retaliated against Western support for Israel by quadrupling prices. That era's shift from corporate concessions to total nationalization by states like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela turned oil into the ultimate diplomatic lever. The current spike in prices is merely the latest chapter in a long history of the Middle East, reclaiming what geologists once called the greatest single prize in history. Today's pricing engine is a precarious machine where physical reality meets speculative fear. The current bottleneck in the Strait of Hormuz has forced Brent crude up toward $84 a barrel, while domestic diesel, the literal fuel of the global supply chain, has surged to a staggering $4.12 per gallon. These spikes are amplified by a 15% seasonal demand surge as spring arrives, coinciding with drone strikes on Saudi refineries, and Qatar's sudden withdrawal of liquefied natural gas from the market. Beyond the headlines, the mechanics of the pump are influenced by a complex web of refined product scarcity. Because inventory for diesel and gasoline is already tight, the loss of even a fraction of the supply usually transiting the Persian Gulf creates an unusually strong weekly climb that the U.S. government is now attempting to buffer with maritime insurance for tankers. It is a system where a single closed waterway can effectively tax every commuter and logistics firm on the planet simultaneously. The clash at the heart of this crisis pits the fundamental right of sovereign nations to control their most valuable resource against the existential need of industrial powers to maintain a stable global economy. Advocates for nationalization argue that for too long, foreign entities extracted wealth while leaving local infrastructures to crumble, viewing the current price hikes as the necessary cost of regional autonomy. On the other hand, critics and global economists fear that using oil as a geopolitical weapon risks a systemic collapse that punishes the world's poorest consumers. They contend that the volatility inherent in state-controlled energy markets creates a feedback loop of inflation and instability that ultimately undermines the very progress these resource-rich nations hope to achieve. As the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation moves to ensure the Persian Gulf shipping lanes, we are entering an era where energy security is no longer just a trade policy, but a military mandate. Market analysts expect another 15-cent climb before the pace of hikes begins to moderate, signaling a permanent shift away from the low-cost stability of the previous decade. The cheap energy that built the modern world is becoming a luxury of the past.